All right, so today we're diving deep into this documentary, Disconnect, the silent killer of brain cells.
Ooh. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just the title alone.
Yeah.
Right? Kind of makes you want to think twice before you unlock your phone again.
It does grab your attention, that's for sure.
It does. So let's break it down.
Yeah.
For our listeners, first off, tell us a little bit about, the format of the documentary. What are we dealing with here?
Yeah, so it's very interview heavy.
Okay.
A lot of talking heads. And it's interesting. It's a mix of like scientists and researchers mixed with people who are like sharing their personal experiences, like their anecdotes.
Okay.
So, they're really trying to like back up their claims with kind of, hard science, but also those relatable stories.
Yeah. Make it hit home a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, speaking of those claims, let's get into it. What's the big takeaway?
So they're making the case that, our smartphones, they're addictive.
Okay.
And that addiction, that overuse can actually lead to some like detrimental effects on our brain health.
Okay. So see, this is what I'm curious about.
Yeah.
When they say like silent killer of brain cells, like, are they saying that our phones are literally like destroying our brains?
Well, they do use some pretty strong language, but it's a little more nuanced than that. It's not like your brain cells are like dying off in droves or anything, just from like checking Instagram.
Yeah.
But it's more about the changes that happen.
Changes like what?
Like how our brains actually function.
Okay, I'm listening.
So, for example, they talk about a study from UCLA.
Yes.
And this study found that people who use social media a lot, like excessively, they tend to have less gray matter.
Less gray matter? What does that mean?
So gray matter is important. It's like the brain tissue involved in like how we think and how we make decisions and our self-control, stuff like that.
So less gray matter. That's not good.
It's not ideal. And this reduction, it's happening in the prefrontal cortex, which is like the front part of your brain. It's like the executive center. It's a big deal.
Interesting, because it's almost like, that's the area, like you said, the decision-making, self-control, and I feel like that's the first thing to go when like you get sucked into, the social media scroll, you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. And the documentary actually talks about that.
Right.
They argue that it's not just like a coincidence.
Right.
It's by design.
Okay.
These phones, these apps, they're designed to be addictive.
Okay, so how so? We all kind of know that like intuitively, but what is it specifically?
It's all these little things, the notifications, right?
Yeah.
Like that little red dot.
Oh, I hate.
You have to clear it. The endless feeds that you can just keep scrolling and scrolling. It never ends.
Yeah.
And then there's the likes, the comments, all of that triggers like the reward pathways in our brains.
Right. So it's hitting those pleasure centers, making us crave more.
Exactly. It's like a little dopamine hit. Every time you get a notification, you get you see something interesting.
Yeah.
And so we're constantly seeking that out.
Interesting. Okay. So we've talked about, the addictive nature. We've talked about how it might be impacting our brains, even if it's not, literally killing brain cells.
Yeah.
But the documentary also kind of touches on the broader mental health implications of this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I think it gets really interesting and really important.
Okay, so what do they say about that?
So they talk about this growing body of research that's linking excessive screen time to things like anxiety and depression and difficulty concentrating. And one expert in the film, they make this comparison. They say that being constantly connected, like we are with our smartphones, it's like being on high alert all the time.
Oh, what?
You're always on edge. Your brain never really gets a break.
And I'm sure a lot of people listening right now can relate to that feeling of like, kind of falling down the rabbit hole, scrolling, and then you look up and it's been like an hour. And you're like, oh my gosh, I should be doing something else.
Right.
And there's that feeling you get afterwards where you're almost like you said, you're drained.
Yeah, you're exhausted. You're maybe even more anxious than you were before.
Exactly.
Because you haven't really unplugged.
Yeah. Okay, so, they're painting kind of a bleak picture here.
They do.
Like, what are we supposed to do? Like, if we're buying into all of this, like, what's the solution?
Well, I think the takeaway, it's not to throw our phones away and go live in the woods.
Okay.
Although tempting sometimes.
Right.
It's more about finding that balance. It's about being mindful.
Okay, so how do we do that? Like, what are some strategies?
So they suggest things like, setting screen time limits, which a lot of phones actually have built in now, which is kind of interesting.
Right.
Creating phone-free zones.
Yeah.
Like in your house, like maybe the bedroom's off limits.
Right, like no phones at the dinner table.
Exactly. And then I think most importantly is scheduling time for activities that actually promote real-world connections.
Okay.
So, going out with friends, spending time with family.
Picking up a hobby, something like that.
Yeah, anything that gets you off your phone, engaging with the world.
Okay, so it's less about, like, demonizing the technology and more about just, like, finding a healthier way to coexist with it, Okay, well, this has definitely given me a lot to think about. I mean, even if we kind of knew all this stuff going in, it's different when you hear it, backed up by experts and seeing those personal stories.
Right, and I think that's what the documentary does well. It really brings it to life, even if they do maybe lay it on a little thick sometimes.
Yeah, and I think a good takeaway, at least for me, is that, it's an ongoing conversation. Like, the science is still evolving. We're still learning about the long-term impacts of this technology. But I think it's safe to say that being mindful of our usage is never going to be a bad thing.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, I'm going to leave our listeners with this. What if stepping away from your phone could make you smarter, happier, healthier? Something to think about. Until next time.